This episode of the Zero Cafe podcast is made possible by our partners, Online Influence Institute and VWO. Today I talk with Abi Hough, and she's an optimization consultant and A/B testing QA expert, which makes her the perfect person to talk to about the top 10 reasons that your A/B tests will fail the QA phase. In case you missed the previous episode, last time I spoke with Tawab Jabbar about digital marketing in Nigeria and working remotely as a growth marketeer. You can listen to that episode on www.zero.cafe or in the podcast app you're listening with right now. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 8. Abi, welcome to the Zero Cafe podcast. And with your extensive experience in Zero, 16 years working in Zero in different roles. So what kind of roles did you have over the years?
Oh my goodness, I've probably gone and done all of them. So I left, I did a degree in computer science. I have no idea why I did that. It just seemed like a good choice at the time. But one of the modules in computer science was based around usability. And out of the 30 odd modules that I did, that was the only one that piqued my interest in the slightest. So I left uni and then I started out as a front-end developer. So making it all look very pretty. And then I started working for a company called Love Film, and I came across, much to my own detriment, a gentleman called Craig Sullivan, which I'm sure a few of your listeners may have heard of. And Craig was working as the UX consultant for this company called Love Film, which was kind of a precursor to being bought out by Netflix. So you ordered DVDs online, you got them posted through your door, and voila, you had a whole load of stuff to view. And Craig came in and he started talking about all this sort of weird stuff like user sessions and, user research. And as a front-end developer, it really piqued my interest, especially in the first session that he ran with users who came into the Love Film studios, and we ran them through the website, and it was utter amazement to me that this website I'd spent hours and hours doing the front end work on, people didn't know how to use it. Even though I thought it was really obvious how stuff worked, these users were looking completely perplexed. And that's kind of how I got started into it. So I carried on with the front end work and then got more and more involved in the UI UX side of things. And then I noticed Craig noticed actually that I was quite good at breaking stuff. And whether or not that's because I'm massively picky and I've got quite high standards about the work I do, but I'm quite critical. So if there was something wrong with the website, it'd always be me saying, well, that's not working and that's awful. Why have you done it like that? And then I kind of moved into doing QA side of stuff as well. At first, that was all kind of very technical. So does it do this? Does it do that? Yes, it does. No, it doesn't. It's broken. It works. And that kind of then morphed more into looking what we would consider UX bugs rather than just functional bugs. So taking all that user research into consideration and then evaluating the websites to see whether or not they were up to par as to what we'd discovered through the user research. And that carried on for many years. And then I kind of moved more over to the CRO side of things. So when it became a bit more mainstream. So what we were doing at Love Film was optimization now as you know it. But before anybody really knew it was optimization or any of that kind of work. So it was quite interesting to kind of gradually move through that. And then I started work at Endless Gain. So I did a lot of freelancing before I started at Endless Gain, and then I took on a permanent role and was director of optimization, and that was running quite a few large accounts for them, for their clients, and running their optimization programs really. But doing everything, not just project managing it, I suppose. I never wanted to be shoehorned into just doing that because it's not my bag. I like to be the person that's doing stuff. So involved in all of the user research and looking at the analytics and looking at the business objectives. And then, not necessarily building experiments because my developer days are quite far behind me now. I'm too old and long in the tooth for that kind of malarkey. But designing the tests and specifying them and all of the wireframing and then the analysis post-test as well. So kind of like I've done a bit of everything really. But I've always enjoyed pulling stuff apart and critiquing it and just generally being a complete pain in the ass for developers. That's the easiest way to put it, really.
I think being critical makes you an annoying teammate, but it's great for Q&A.
Well, yes, and people still hate QA, and I'm still at it, and I think that's probably why I still get quite a lot of work in, because people generally hate QA. They find it so boring and so laborious, and don't necessarily. That's my doorbell. Sorry about that. Don't necessarily see the importance of it, but from the work that I've done, actually QA is one of the things that you really, really need to be looking at. Otherwise, what you're doing is completely pointless. You can't rely on the data that you're getting through as to whether or not something has worked or not if it doesn't work properly in the first place. So you might be saying something's a golden egg when actually it's a bit of a turkey. And when we're making big business decisions about these experiments that we're running, it's really quite important that we get it right.
So would you say you feel more like a specialist or more like a generalist?
I would... God, that's a really hard question. I probably would put myself in the generalist category, but with a specialism. So I don't think I'm either end of the scale.
You're what we call a T-shaped player. That's how some growth companies call it. You have the top of the T, as in there's a very broad base, and you have a specialism in a couple of those areas.
Yeah, that was a perfect description of it. I'm not one for formal terminology. You'll get the idea by the end of this podcast, I'm sure of it. But yes, that's probably a good way of describing it. But I think anybody in this role needs to have a good understanding of everything, especially when you're a freelancer or a consultant, right? It's really hard to get work in if you just say, well, I just do this. I don't think there's any point in putting yourself in a particular category. I think that kind of limits your options a bit. And, just to get a whole oversight of optimization generally, you need to understand all the facets that make it up. So, being a generalist, or T-shape, as you say, is probably quite beneficial. I would recommend it. Yeah.
And today we're going to talk about the top 10 reasons A/B test QA fails. Basically, what the CRO manager is doing wrong.
What the whole team is doing wrong. Yeah.
What the whole team is doing wrong before it goes to QA. So did you have to struggle to get to 10, or did you have to struggle to bring it back to 10?
Struggled to keep it to 10, really. There are so many little things that can go wrong, but you can sort of group them into 10 rough categories. But any experiment that you push out is a bit like an octopus, right? There's tentacles going everywhere, and the propensity for anything to go wrong at any point. And that's probably why I quite enjoy it. But it's also one of the things that make a good QA person, I would say, because you have to be a person of the kind of mentality where you're not following the mainstream of thought. You have to be that person that's going, but what if? And that's one of the really important things about QA. You have to have that way of thinking. So it's just, if you have a test, for example, that's looking at the PDP, or, the standard kind of A/B test you might get. A QA person wouldn't just be looking at that experiment running on that PDP page. They'd be thinking, okay, so how does this affect if I go through to checkout? Or what are the promotion codes? Are they still working? Are there things mentioned in this test that logically elsewhere should be mentioned on the website? How does it link through from the listing page? All of these kind of different avenues that you could go down that this experiment might potentially sort of impact. You have to kind of think of them all and have that sort of like not quite linear train of thought.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So and there's basically two reasons why it's helpful to keep these 10 things in mind. Of course, one is generally if you don't catch them, it's bad for the user experience. But of course, even when you do catch them, it just takes time. So if we can prevent them as a CRO team before they go to QA, it would make things much faster, and we can put out more things.
Exactly that. And this is one of the most important things to get across, really. A QA should be the point of an experiment where you have a look through it and you go, bingo, that's perfect. We got it all right. A QA isn't the point where it should be like, oh my God, we've listed 20 different issues of the experiment, or the client comes back to you and says, oh, I didn't really think it was going to do that. That's not quite what I had in mind. That's also a QA issue, right? So it means something hasn't been caught in the entire process that should have been previously. So it's looking at that sort of life cycle as a whole, from the very beginning, from the first point where somebody comes up with a bright idea, the light bulb goes over their head. QA should really be part of that process from the very beginning, not just the end point before somebody sets something live.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's start with number one. You didn't specify anything. That one seems obvious, but apparently it's not.
It's not. Apparently it's not. So my view on this, so let's limit it to A/B testing. Every A/B test that you do should be treated as a new feature that you're releasing on a website, right? So, all right, you might not say if you were just doing copy testing, for example, that's an exception. But anything beyond that, you really should be specifying out what you want this experiment to do. It could be, it doesn't have to be a formal specification, but just having it written down so that everybody knows what this experiment is going to do, how it's going to function. So the developers know what they're building, so the designers know what roughly the whole game plan is, and also so that the client can read through that and understand it from the outset, what this A/B test running on their website is going to do to their website and what potential implications that might have for them. So it can even be just a checklist, it's going to do A, B, and C. It's going to run on this page, and this page. All the fundamental things that probably running through somebody's head who's designing this experiment or have thought about the experiment. It's as simple as just listing it down. And the amount of times that I come across A/B tests that I'm QAing and there isn't any kind of formal specification. We all bang on about having a hypothesis written down and our audiences and all of that. And that's great and gravy. But when it comes down to what it actually needs to do, sadly, we are somewhat behind the curve on doing that for most A/B tests. And it just has such massive benefits for everybody involved in it. And by specifying at the beginning like that, then it means further down the line, like we talked about previously, we don't get the hiccups that I see commonly in QAs when they come to me, in that it doesn't look quite right, doesn't really function in the way that it was supposed to, and the client doesn't end up throwing their toys out of the pram because what they were expecting is not what they're now looking at. So it's basically getting everybody singing from the same song sheet at the beginning of any A/B test cycle, so we all know what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and you say, well, it should at least be a rough description, but I think rough can mean different things for different people.
It can. It can.
So I think it helps when you have at least, like you said, also maybe a checklist of things that you need to specify.
Yep.
I don't know, like the audience or the pages it needs to run on. It's helpful to have that not just one open field, but already upfront specify the things you want to have specified.
Yes, exactly. And the detail of that specification will obviously change depending on where you're working on the website. So, for example, if you're running a checkout experiment, then immediately for me, that is a massive red flag, right? That is like risk level 10, basically, because if it goes wrong, you're going to have a really angry client on your case, and you don't want that. So to give you an example, one of the checkout A/B tests that I have run, the specification ran to like over 20 pages worth of details. And that doesn't just include what the experiment needed to do, but also, how do we actually QA this? What processes do we need to do to make sure the changes we've made in the checkout have not totally broken something? And that might be checks that you have to run against the back office with the client to make sure that the orders are going through, running a number of test orders through, all of this kind of information. And maybe I'm just super pessimistic that everything's going to go terribly wrong. And I think 2020.
That's the assumption you have to have as a
Well,
QA
yes, exactly. And I think that pessimism's paid quite well over 2020 and 2021. See, I'm not disappointed about the whole coronavirus thing because I was almost expecting it. But yeah, you have to have a degree of pessimism. But it really is about getting that detail in. And people think that, oh my gosh, there's so much effort to do this. Why is she banging on about it? But if you look at it subjectively, and I can do this because I've done so many QAs now, it actually ends up saving time and money in the long run. People don't really see it like that because they just see the immediate impact. It's like, oh God, that's like 2 days worth of QA. Let's just get this test out the door.
Yeah.
That's not my take on it at all. So
no, and you can get it out of the door, but you're probably not measuring what you want to measure if all of these things go wrong.
Exactly right. And, you know, as optimizers, we're all based on data. Okay. So the very least that we can do is ensure that what we're running is gathering correct data in the first place. Otherwise, we're kind of, you know, not practicing what we preach in the slightest.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So if you would need to transfer the QA process to someone else, if you want to train someone, and even if it's for the same for a single client, how would you describe it? I can imagine that there's just no fixed QA. It totally depends on the experiment.
Yep.
What you need to QA. So how do you even approach that?
I don't know that you can. If I'm being brutally honest about it. So I've had lots of people ask me over the years to do, can you train us in QA? You must have a set method of doing it. And
you just need to be a very pessimistic person. That's the
so that's the first point. But I've actually found it, and I have tried several times to kind of put training together for how to do QA.
Yeah.
And it's almost impossible because, like you say, not only is it a mindset thing, and you kind of have to have that inbuilt mindset. I don't know that it's necessarily something that you can develop. And also in terms of process, there's only a limited amount that you can standardize as a process. So an example is you might write a QA matrix for a page, right? So you list out all of the things that you need to check on a page and have a massive checklist and just go through it as you go through. But the problem is that changes on a client by client basis and a page by page basis and an experiment by experiment basis. So even standardizing that is really difficult. And then people will say to me, well, you could automate scripts to run a QA to make sure it's all working right. And my argument against that is yes, automating scripts is fine for where you have a website that is generally in a fairly stable state. Okay, so nothing really changes. So the amount of time that you have to invest in even just creating all those automated scripts, that works quite well for a stable environment. But with A/B testing, obviously the life cycle that something is on a website, depending on the traffic volumes, changes, yeah? So if I'm working on a site and a test only needs to run for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it might be, I'm not going to spend the best part of a day automating a script to test that that's fine and all hunky-dory, because that experiment will be in the sunset in a few weeks. So that, to me, is wasted effort. So all of my QA kind of, it's literally, it's really dynamic. It can't be standardized in any kind of way, particularly within the CRO. Yeah. So trying to get somebody trained up to do that, not only do you have, like you say, have to have this crazy ass mindset of weird people like me, but trying to fix that into any kind of structure is quite difficult. So it sounds all a bit airy-fairy, and I'm sure there are people out there that would disagree with what I've just said, but I'm going to say my QA fail rate is probably 99%. All of the experiments that I have ever looked at have failed on the first QA. And I think that's because I don't have that standard kind of way of dealing with it. And, you know, it's paid off because some of the issues that I found could have been absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah. So 15 minutes in and we're at point 2.
Yeah, you were right about your hour. I can talk, man. You think Craig Sullivan can talk? I'm even worse than him.
Imagine someone doing a podcast with the both of you.
It would be awesome. I think you're going to ask me about who you should get on here next. I'm going to suggest me and Craig together. It'd be good for comedy value, if nothing else.
Reason number 2, you didn't wireframe or design thoroughly.
Yes. Yeah, this is another interesting one. So a lot of times when I've been dealing with experiments that have come to me for QA, I will always look through the wireframes and designs to know what I'm QAing against. And 9 times out of 10, I will get one wireframe to describe an experiment that has multiple interactions or steps or parts of a process in order to get through that test for the user. So don't present just one wireframe of what it looks like. I need to know what happens if a modal pops up. What happens if there's an error message? How is that supposed to look? Is it the default standard error messaging on the website? Or have you done something crazy with this A/B test that has changed all of that? So for each, this goes back to the specification, for each of those things specified, if you've got a specification, I need wireframes to describe that behavior to me so I know what I'm QAing against. And that also goes back to then helping the client understand what's going to happen further down the line so that they have built up this knowledge of what to expect. It's all about managing client expectations. And if you even better, an interactive prototype, if it's necessary, why not? I mean, because that kind of describes to everybody what's going to have in a way that requires a minimal amount of time and investment to do. But the clarity that it offers means that, the QA is potentially going to go a lot better at the end of the life cycle rather than if you didn't have it. So yeah, don't, I've had wireframes sent to me on bits of paper. Oh, yeah, that's what it does, Abby. I was like, yeah, that's not really going to help me or anybody else for that matter, is it? Maybe I'm just dealing with really, really awful people. Maybe that's it. I don't know. But yeah, wireframes, and moving on from wireframes, if you're designing something, then you've really got to make sure the design is up to par. And especially when it comes to things like branding guidelines, because that's another thing that often falls over on a QA, is the design hasn't kept to within an acceptable tolerance for the client about what they want to see on their website. If you need to have a discussion about the client about going away from their branding or their tone of voice or their imagery guidelines, whatever it is, have that conversation right at the beginning and get it all squared away. Don't just go, yeah, look at this amazing thing we've done. And the client's like, yeah, no. Yeah. So the point about that is, really, if you're going to wireframe it, make sure it's thoroughly wireframed, because again, the developers and the designers and the client and everybody has that expectation. This is that they know what they're going to get and not some other nasty surprise.
Yeah. Will this work? Maybe not. Isn't that what we're all trying to figure out? With VWO, create and A/B test different variations of your website to continuously discover the best performing versions that improve conversions. Stop guessing. Start A/B testing with VWO today.
Reason number 3. That's a fun one. Your client-side code sucks.
Yeah.
So in general for the website or specifically for the experiment?
Well, both, actually. So I've been talking about this for years. One of my key arguments is that before you start A/B testing on any website, you really need to get your house in order and understand what you're dealing with, right? So if you think about the way that A/B tests work, 90% of the time, excluding any sort of server-side testing, you're dealing with the CSS, HTML, JavaScript, whatever it is that's on the client side, right? So if you have got a website that is producing error after error, there's problems with that code in its generic form, and then you come along and you're like, oh, I'm going to run this A/B test and change all of this stuff, right, and manipulate it to make a page look like I want it to behave or look. You're kind of making really a lot of work for yourself, because you're having to get over all those problems that are on the website as it exists. and you're having to work around those in order to get your A/B test to work or look in the way that you want it to. So one of the things that I always recommend is that you do a client audit on a website and try and get them to get that website code in as good a state as possible. You almost kind of want a clean slate when you're running A/B tests on the client website, because that makes less work for you. And it also reduces the chances of your test screwing up down the line. Another good example of this is, and something that I see quite frequently, is an A/B test is running on a client website and it stops working, and you're looking at it and you're thinking, well, it was okay when it went out. I did the QA on it. I know it was fine. And then you realize the client drops you a message, goes, oh yeah, we did a site release. Sorry about that. We didn't tell you. And I'm betting there are a few people listening to this podcast that have come across this situation. And that goes, that's a whole problem with client communications and stuff like that. But, trying to work on that clean slate is the first most important point. And secondly, to make sure that you're aware of any site changes that happen. But then you're right, your code sucks. And that's the second point you mentioned. I really hope that nobody listening to this is using the what you see is what you get editors that are made available in some testing platforms. I'm not going to name any names or anything like that. But no.
They all have it. They all have WYSIWYG editors.
They will. And, they'll all say, oh, it's brilliant. You can shuffle crap around on this page by moving the mouse and it looks amazing. And, drag and drop and all of this is really not good. Just don't use it, because invariably it won't pass QA when you look at it properly. It will add so much weight to the page, the performance is impacted, and you're not going to get, very good cross-device experience on it either. So really, you need to make sure you're coding this as a developer would, not as, somebody just sat there pushing stuff around in a browser window. So at all levels, avoid WYSIWYG editors. Yeah. And if you don't know how to code, then learn how to code so you're not, relying on that as a way to generate A/B tests. Yeah.
Or get into contact with a decent freelancer that has some experience.
Yes, exactly. And they're like hen's teeth as well. Getting decent A/B test developers is a whole different podcast, I'm sure of it. Yeah.
Reason number 4, your A/B tests fail QA, is that your QA person is not a QA person.
Yes. And we've talked about that a little bit, haven't we? QA people are a unique breed of person, for sure. But I think QA can be broken down to a number of different steps. And there's 4 of them, I reckon. So I reckon you should have a developer QA, right? So this is where you ask the developer to QA their work before they give it to anybody to look at, okay? And they will look at it from a very technical point of view. They'll go, yep, I haven't got any code errors, everything's functioning, no syntax errors. It's doing exactly what it says against that specification that they wrote for me, right? And they will check it hopefully, they'll check it cross-device. This is another thing that should go in your specification, hopefully. By the way. Yes, what devices and browsers it's running on. So you want the developer to kind of do all of that techie stuff, right? Just to make sure it's sound from a technical point of view and a functional point of view. And then you kind of have a QA. And that person will look at the developer, the code that the developer's done in the test. Once the developer's QA'd it, the QA will then look at it and go, yeah, it passes that box, that box, that box. It looks pretty good against the specification. I'm quite happy with that. But again, a QA person at that level, they may be quite black and white on it. They'll go, yes, it passes all these functional items. The branding is fine. The code is fine. It's good to go. But then you have the next step, which is like a UX QA. So sometimes stuff can get lost in translation between a developer and what comes out on the browser, if you like. And the UX person is really kind of, I don't want to do that sort of soft skills thing, but it's looking at it to make sure, is there enough affordance on a particular button? Is there enough touch space around an element on a mobile device? So they're kind of looking at all of those things that help the user experience. Is the contrast good enough for me to be able to read that? Is the font large enough for me to be able to read it without squinting, for example? So they're looking at all of those UX elements that we would consider maybe as a separate discipline. I don't know. They should all be part of the same thing. But they're kind of picking up on those and then, assessing whether or not the A/B test is good enough to go out to users. Are they actually going to be able to use what we've proposed? That's the idea. And then you kind of have your user acceptance testing, all right? And at this point in the cycle, that might be where your account manager looks and goes, oh, that's amazing. Or you send it out to the client and they're like, yeah, I'm happy with that. Or they might come back with, well, it's not quite what I was thinking, or could you just tweak this or that? But the user acceptance testing really is that final level where it's just little checks and maybe one or two little tweaks just to get it into like pristine condition. So yeah, you shouldn't just be solely reliant on one QA person to do all of the QA, unless they've got 16 years of experience of doing this sort of stuff. Because I guess if you were to describe what I do, it is kind of those different roles that I've just described to you. So I would cover each of those, but and I'm not trying to sound big-headed, but unless you've got sufficient experience, I think it'd be hard to cover that off as just one person doing the role. So the QA should have kind of like these steps through the life cycle so you can check them all off. And then the user experience testing, that should be the final nod to say, yeah, that's good to go.
Yeah. Reason number 5, and that seems to me for very practical reasons that it doesn't happen often. But reason number 5 is you didn't QA on a real device. And I assume, you will always QA on a device, but I assume this is meant for different devices like phones, tablets, desktops, right?
Yeah. So I'm going to say it. Every person involved in A/B testing should have access to a device library. Yeah, it's a tough one, and people always push back on that. And the primary reason, it's too expensive. Actually, a device library, you probably need maybe 2 mobile phones and a tablet. It's not that much money. When you think about it in those sort of terms, you can buy second-hand devices. And a majority of the time, you don't want to be looking on the latest and greatest iPhone or the biggest iPhone or a fancy tablet or something like that. Because if you look at the analytics, you'll notice that a lot of people aren't actually using them. The audience isn't using these devices. The majority are not. In fact, most of my testing, when we look at the GA, is Samsung S8 and an iPhone 6, right? They're not the latest and greatest devices, but I can guarantee you, if you're sat doing your A/B program, what are you going to have in your hand, right? I know I've got an iPhone 12, right? A mini. There's not many people using those. So there's no point in me QAing on an iPhone 12 mini because that's not what the audience is looking at the website at. So this kind of goes back to when you're running an A/B test program from a client, you really should have a good understanding of what devices that audience are looking at. And it also relates to who you're targeting your A/B test at, right? So if you're just saying iPhone users, just test it on an iPhone that relates to that audience. So if most of your users are using an iPhone 6, have an iPhone 6 in your hand, right? You can probably pick one up for a couple of £100, you know? Is not a massive expense, and at the very least your developers should have access to those physical devices. I can't tell you how important that is, and people will always come back and say, oh, he used BrowserStack. BrowserStack's awesome. Yeah, BrowserStack is good, but it's not awesome. What people miss about BrowserStack is with BrowserStack, you're using a mouse to point on elements on a visual representation of a device, okay? So whilst it might tell you if something is working correctly, again, that question of black or white, yes, it does it, no, it doesn't. What it doesn't give you is the feedback of actually using that physical device in your hand. So, you might have a button on there with a mouse on Browser Stack and you can click on it and it works perfectly. But if you have the device in your hand and you try and tap on it, you've tapped something else because another element is in the way and you go to the wrong place.
Yeah.
So really having that kind of physical device in your hand is imperative. And again, it's another reason why so many tests fail my QAs, because I'm doing the physical device testing and stuff that wouldn't have been picked up, for example, if you were just using Browser Stack, doesn't get picked up on, but it's actually quite critical to the success of the experiment.
Yeah, and I guess you can, like you said, you can just go to your Google Analytics and device list, and then depending on the diversity of devices and the percentage of users you want to cover, you just go down the list and
exactly.
and buy those.
And there's a good clue in GA actually, is if you're looking at the devices, which ones aren't converting so well, right? So you need to be looking at those, like, well, why aren't those converting so well? And this is what your initial audit would be picking up on. So you'd be looking at the website on that particular device and trying to figure out why the conversions are so low or the bounce rate so high. And a lot of that will be based around not necessarily the software that the phone is running, but viewport. You'd be amazed how many people are using tiny phones. And it really does impact on conversion rates. So
yeah, I also don't really get those huge phones. I mean, mine's pretty big. I mean, 5.8 inch, I think, screen diagonal. But I'd rather have a smaller one than a big one. But mainly the battery that's a limitation on the smaller ones.
It's funny that you should mention that. So I had the iPhone XS, right?
Yeah.
Not the massive one, just a standard iPhone XS. And I got so fed up with it, which is why I went down to a 12 mini, because I couldn't hold it in one hand and use it properly. I was literally holding it like a bloody tablet, because I've got like midget fingers and hands and stuff. And I couldn't use it with one hand, with my left hand or my right hand, on their own. And it, even down to things like, it kept falling out of my back pocket of my jeans. And it was just so unwieldy. When the 12 mini came out, I was quite relieved that they hadn't gone down there, let's just create another massive device. It's like, I'm going to need like a table to put it on if they get any bigger.
So go to your Google Analytics, find out the devices people use, and just buy those devices.
Yes.
Reason number 6, you didn't QA in the wild.
Yeah, so how many people are guilty of doing looking at an A/B test on a preview link? I imagine quite a few people, because it's easy, right? Here's a link, here's a preview, looks amazing. I'm not an advocate of that at all. If I can get a test put live on a restricted IP, so I'm lucky enough here to have a static IP, so that's quite straightforward for me. It really is the best way to QA, because you get that full-on immersive experience, if you like, of an A/B test running wild on a website. It lets you pick up loads of different things, like, is there a conflict between A/B tests? Is something not quite right with the audiences or the segments, or is something not making sense? How come I've just been bucketed into a different experience and now the initial experience it's all confusing? So if you can QA an experiment on a live IP, so out in the world, like you say, it gives a much more accurate representation of how that experiment's going to work.
What would be examples of things that don't work with a preview URL, but do work when you put them in live mode on your IP, for example?
So quite a few things. I think the primary one is just making sure that there are no conflicts running between A/B tests. See that quite a lot, where the bucketing isn't working properly. So that's probably the primary thing. But also, if you can get it live on an IP, it's also a bit easier to kind of test it on a 4G connection, for example. That's doable. So you get a good sort of input on the performance as well. So I just prefer it. And maybe that's just down to my own sense of being quite pernickety about stuff. I would rather test it on that live IP if I can than have a preview. I'm not a massive fan of previews. I don't care what people say. You need to see it out in the live. Honestly, I'm just saying it as a recommendation. Just do it. Yeah.
Reason number 7, you didn't QA for your audience.
Yeah, we sort of, so yeah, we've kind of covered this a little bit. So the primary reasons around this is making sure you've got that device in your hand that your users are using. And also it's not just devices, but also when it comes to, browsers, for example, not everybody's using Chrome. Just putting that out there. Still see people using Internet Explorer.
Even that one, Edge.
Yeah, Edge, exactly. I still do get IE coming in, even though they've killed it now. I still see it coming in. But also another important one is around resolution, especially on desktop as well. A lot of people have big fancy monitors. I've got 3 of them sat in front of me, which is awesome. Nobody at home's generally going to have 3 massive monitors sat in front of them. And surprisingly, the most common resolution that I see in GA is tiny. It's like laptop size resolution, so 1366 by 768 or something like that. You have a look at a web browser at that resolution.
Things are different. It's a different world.
Yeah, it's different. And sometimes if you get your breakpoints all screwed up, then they're flicked to mobile experiences at that resolution. So that's also something to be quite wary of. It affects the whole QA and the whole way that your A/B test comes across to your audience. So just be very mindful.
I also see this often. So when you say targeting your audience, that when you create this whole experience on the website, which is fine, but if it's targeted as a specific audience, like for example from people from your newsletter, that's a newsletter campaign that they send over, you need to look at the newsletter. The message there might be completely different, not aligned with what you have on your website, or similar with when you create AdWords, for example. Those need to be included in that QA.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, that's kind of like the next point as well, is around this QA mindset. So when you're QAing something, you need to be in that headspace of your users. So like we said, it's not going to be a linear journey. They're not going to go from the home page to a listing page to a product page and, to the basket and then to the checkout. That doesn't happen. You really have to have a stab round in analytics or any other kind of data gathering to understand that's not how users behave. So you need to have this kind of like random, distracted kind of approach to the QA as well. So don't take that linear path. Go to a product page first, or go to a listing page first, or do a search first, and then go into the experiment. How does it perform?
Yeah, and then go get a coffee and then come back.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not going to lie. I've done drunk QA before. That was quite a lot of fun. Everybody should do that just for a laugh, I think. But
we can do a live session, like a live Zero Cafe podcast session, drunk QA.
Drunk QA, and then we could do like shop bingo for every problem that we find.
Yeah, that sounds great.
I'll be up for that.
Yeah.
Yesterday's brainstorm was so good. I really liked Steph's idea of running that test on the call to action buttons. Making them orange will really make them stand out, don't you think?
Yeah, right. Do you want to design real A/B test winners and achieve enormous conversion uplift? Then stop brainstorming and take a scientific approach. If you can read Dutch, follow the steps in Online Invloed, the bestseller on managementbook.nl. Or enroll in the author's course and become an expert in applying proven behavioral science yourself. Go to onlineinfluence.com for more information and free downloads. I think one problem with not QAing for the audience, that like you said, this is the way we work, right? We're usually doing this behind the desk. You have your monitor set up, you have your nice setup. That's not how your users are using it, and often it's more and more often it's through a mobile device.
Yep.
But you don't do QA all day on a mobile device.
No,
that's not how you
exactly that. You need
and same for the developer and the designer. Of course, It's not limited to QA, but
no, and you should go outside. How many times are we on our mobile devices outside, right? Not in January, but in the summer months, go outside, look at what how does bright sunlight affect the user experience? So, put yourself in Joe Bloggs' place and imagine what they might be doing. A great example, would be me today. I could be looking to browse something, but I'm getting a million interruptions from a child asking about fraction questions, for example. So I'm not strictly concentrating on just making that purchase. I've got other things going on, the doorbell's ringing, music playing, the dog's barking. It's just take yourself out of the box. Nobody is generally sat in front of a computer.
You also at home, of course, you have a process running that every 15 minutes a doorbell goes. Even if there's no one there, right? That's how you QA.
Everybody's getting online deliveries now, right? So
exactly. Reason number 8, you didn't set it up right.
Yeah, so basic fundamentals. So when is the experience going to trigger? Who's going to see it? And what do I need to measure to understand whether this thing even worked? They're pretty straightforward fundamentals, but again, it takes no time to check whether those things are set up properly. And the measurements one is quite interesting. A lot of times I see tests that, they just kind of go off the standard metrics. But what about event tracking, for example? What extra information can you gain about how this experiment has performed by just, monitoring clicks or, what's actually happening? And if you can kind of get that picture through event tracking or, even setting up, for example, Hotjar to run on pages when this experiment is fired, you can get so much extra data and feedback than just relying on whatever your platform says happened. Why don't you do it? So it's not really an additional amount of extra time to put those elements in and to make sure that they're running correctly. But the benefits you get from having them in just gives you a much more wholesome sort of evaluation of how that experiment performed or didn't. And it's a good point to say in there, if you can put in some kind of like tripwires to understand that, if your experiment's gone a bit wrong, like it's stopped working or, there's no visitors going through it for whatever reason, if you can put those mechanisms to monitor the experience overall as it's live, then you're going to be in a much better place throughout its life cycle and at the end of it when you're analysing it. So, yeah.
Reason number 9. You thought you were Penn or Teller. And for those who are not familiar with these magicians,
they're awesome. I love Penn and Teller. I like magic.
Go to YouTube. Look
up Penn and Teller. Yeah, this kind
or just go to Vegas directly.
But if only we could.
When you can, of course.
Yeah, if only we could fly.
when you can travel. Yeah.
I don't know when that's going to be. I'm wiping out 2021. I think we're all screwed. Yeah. I'm aiming for 2022. So this is what we were talking about earlier. In that it's trying to keep the client informed at all points of the process and not doing that. Here's a test that we designed and we're putting it live tomorrow thing. Try not to do that, and also set the client's expectation about what is, generally feasible on A/B testing. Some of the clients that I've dealt with have come up with some of the most, I'm trying to think of the right word, not exciting, overly complicated experiments to run, client-side A/B is just not possible for what they want to do. So it's always setting that expectation of what is feasible and also pulling into a line and reminding them what the business objectives are, if they have any, and how that testing roadmap should be reflected with that. Don't go all sort of crazy and try and rewrite the rule book. A lot of the clients that I deal with are relatively new to kind of optimization and stuff, so it requires a little bit of a gentle footing to introduce them to it. And some clients are really receptive. They're like, oh my God, we want to get going. And that's the response that you want. But other clients are a bit more reserved because they're not fully aware of what the whole process is, right? So with those, you have to be a little more gentle. And, if you tailor what you're doing, so you may just start with some copywriting experiments or something like that, but it's more of a gently approach. So it's not scaring people off before they've even started, really. But all of those sort of like concerns, I think, really can be addressed when we talk about the sort of client expectation setting all the way through the cycle. So explaining everything, because a lot of clients will be nervous and like, well, what do you mean you're going to run something on my site that might break it? So if we can mitigate all those risks, so they know exactly what they're getting, exactly how it's going to function, when it's going to run, who it's going to show to, and prove to them that we've got a thorough QA process, so nothing's going to break, mitigating all of those concerns that they might have, and also making them realize that just because an A/B test is live doesn't mean it takes, any more than a second to stop it if something goes wrong. If something goes so cataclysmically wrong, it can be stopped in an instant. I think a lot of people kind of miss that point. It really is a button press to stop something that's gone horribly wrong. Not that it should do, because everything should be so thoroughly thought out at the beginning and all the way through the process. Yes, it might fail, but not to a point where it's like, everybody's trying to think of how we get out of this situation and how do we explain it. That should never really happen. Yeah. And also kind of explaining them that failure is not bad. Everybody talks about this. Failing is not necessarily bad. You always learn something and take something away from it. It's like, well, we won't do that again, or we'll do it in a slightly different way.
That's the point that I often get. Yeah, it might go horribly wrong. Yeah. And that's my ideal situation, actually, because then we learn something.
Exactly, right?
Well, maybe not the ideal situation.
Yeah. And I think people in the industry are very quick to kind of cite, we, made this much revenue over the past 6 months or whatever. It's all amazing. But actually, I'm with you on this. I'm more interested in the experiments that failed because it challenges my way of thinking, right? So if I've designed something and it's failed, I'm then thinking, ooh.
That's interesting.
Rather than getting a winning experiment where I'm more likely to go, yeah, all right. We'll move on to something else. But getting those failures allows you to get a much deeper understanding of how that audience are behaving on that website, So
getting the wins allows you to stay in your job. Getting the failures allow you to get better at your job.
Yes, I like that. But we shouldn't just see everything, winners being the only winning criteria. Yes, it's lovely, but does it extend, that knowledge that we're trying to get the very root of, right? We want to make this so much better for everybody. Failure definitely offers more insights than a win, I think. So
yeah, and I would definitely say don't become teller, because teller doesn't. For those who don't know, teller doesn't speak at all. That's not helpful. That's not helpful when doing QA.
Oh, I don't know. Sometimes I found it useful to bite my tongue rather than say something. So.
But then at least you have the option.
Yeah,
teller doesn't talk at all. We made it almost. Number 10.
Yeah.
Experiment pollution.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I'm just trying to remind myself what I'm talking about here. So, come on then. How many times have you kind of gone into an A/B test platform and there are like a gazillion tests at 100%, running at 100%?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of my biggest bugbears. And there's a couple of reasons for that. A, because of my OCD. So I hate seeing stuff sat in a platform at 100% live when it should be in development, right? The client should be pushing that out onto the site. Can't stand lists of stuff. It annoys me.
Especially then they don't realize. Usually, especially now with all the cookies, usually your A/B testing platform goes to a third-party cookie that people need to actively consent to, and depending on the country you live in. But that means that part of your users don't see your experiment. So if you put all those things live through your experimentation platform, maybe only 80%, worse, maybe just 70% of the people see whatever changes you are making. And if those are important changes, they just see the wrong information on your website.
Yeah. So it screws all of that up, right? That cookies are a whole new podcast. You need to do one of those with a cookie expert. Yes, so it's not.
We had a couple of those last year.
I think you probably need to do some more now.
They keep changing things. So it's a very interesting topic.
Yeah. So it's basically, don't treat an A/B test platform like a CMS, right? It's not a CMS. Get that shit out there. You don't do it. There's a couple of other issues, the kind of like the more experiments you have running live at 100% on these platforms, it's got a performance hit, right? Everybody knows about screen flicker. Oh my God. I mean, how many times have I been on websites recently? It's like, somebody's running an A/B test. Yep. It's so obvious. It's awful. That has an impact on conversions in its own right. Yeah. If you can see a page changing in front of your very eyes, you're like, oh, what are they up to?
But I don't see it that often. So either I should be worried because no one's running experiments, or those experiment tools are getting really good at this. But
yeah. So there's a performance side of it, and then we go back to this layered cake thing that we were talking about earlier about, making sure a client site code is up to par before you start A/B testing on it. What then happens if you start putting A/B test upon A/B test upon A/B test upon A/B test, even running on the same page, let alone on separate pages, and they're all sat in this A/B test platform doing whatever they're doing on that website? How difficult does it then become to QA and isolate your QAs against, this myriad of other experiments that you've got running on the website, right? It makes it infinitely more difficult. So stop doing that.
Yeah, and in terms of page load, especially when you create those tests through your WYSIWYG editor.
Yes, exactly. Don't do that either. But yes, there are massive, and it's a cumulative effect. So it gets worse and worse and worse, the more stuff that you keep adding in there. And I'm sure people, who develop these platforms will come back with some clapback and say, that's not true, Abby, you're talking rubbish. It is true because I've seen the performance impact on it and the complexities of that, and then adds to adding, your new A/B test that you want to move on with your roadmap or whatever it is. It just makes it infinitely more difficult. So please, if I had one wish for this year, it would be to stop seeing that happening, because it just makes it so much more difficult for everybody else. And you'll see improvements it also helps the client, right? What's the point in running an A/B test program if you don't roll it out onto the website properly? Yep. Especially the ones where you're very certain that it's a confirmed increase in conversion or whatever goal it was supposed to meet. If that's, an absolute positive, why don't you roll it out onto the website? Isn't the whole idea to make the website better, not to have it kind of stuck together with bits of sellotape of potential winning things that were quite good six months ago?
But Abby, it is working right now. Why do we need to move it into our website? It is already working.
And this is the point, because people see it as working, but it's sat in a blooming A/B test. Oh, don't get me started. It gets me really angry.
Abby, we made it.
Hooray!
We made it through all 10, barely within the hour. So one of my final questions for you on this topic, how much time should people expect to spend on QA? If you go through all these experiments, so from the point when people send you the experiment for QA until the moment that it can actually go live, what's usually the time in between that?
Oh, how long's a piece of string? Depends on the complexity of the experiment, right?
Sure, but there must be some average there, and you have a nice standard deviation that's either very large.
I wish the answer was that simple, but it's not going to be, because this is QA. So it really depends on how complicated the experiment is for a start, right? If you're making a copy change to a homepage, that's not going to take very long. If you're making something more complicated, like, PDP redesign, I've done those before.
A complete website redesign. Yeah,
exactly. So it's measured, the time is directly related to the complexity of the experiment. But then you need to add in how many audiences that you're checking for, how many devices that you need to be looking at, right? invariably it's at least 4 or 5, whether it's mobile devices or different browsers or different resolutions, right? You're going to have at least 5 in that mix, I would say, as a minimum, if you're doing a proper QA, an Abi QA. So yes, it is quite time intensive, but that gets better on the provision that you've done all that stuff that we talked about previously. Okay. So if we've got a good spec, good designs, client's happy with it, nobody's thrown a last minute request in. That's another thing to try and avoid if you can. And when I say a request, I mean something that fundamentally changes the entire experiment. So I'd say for a medium range QA of an A/B test, probably around half a day-ish. But don't quote me on that. Yeah, that's heavily caveated.
Yeah, and I guess when if there's something you still want or need to start with, leave the experiments behind. Just QA the website. Start with that.
Yeah,
it's probably enough to fix already.
Honestly, yeah. So standard audit on a website, I'll usually find between 100 and 200 individual issues that need to be addressed. And that might not just be a functional issue, for example. That covers, I guess the new term would be crux, C-R-U-X, I suppose. So it's kind of like a heuristic that covers everything. So functionality, UX, CRO, conversion blockers, all of that kind of stuff. But invariably, I'll get like 200 items on there. And of course, you're going to prioritize that, right? With your preferred prioritization model, whatever that might be. Another blog topic, I think. But yes, so easily. And a lot of those, let's say half of them, really should be addressed before you even think about doing it. Because what people don't realize is by fixing the stuff that's already broken, you're actually starting optimization. You don't need to jump into the shiny, let's do A/B testing, it's amazing. You need to start at a more fundamental level than that. So if you've got a bug on your website that's stopping people buying something, for example, you're going to get a much higher return on investment by just fixing that. You don't need an A/B test to tell you that needs to be fixed. You just need to fix it, right? So invariably, there
are often so many projects also that go live on the website as an MVP, and then they're live, and it works, and then they move on to the next project. But it's still okay. It was viable by definition, sure. Yeah. Hopefully, but it's still minimal.
Yeah. So I mean that is a solid piece of advice. I'd get an audit done any day of the week, because for the cost of an audit compared to running an A/B entire, whole shabam, you get much higher ROI. And that you've just reminded me of a very important point actually about leaving tests in A/B test platforms, and that's around code maintenance. Want to take a guess?
No, go ahead.
Damn it, I thought I was going to catch you. So the problem we have with leaving stuff sat in a platform, right, is say you have something sat in there for a year, and I have had that experience.
Yeah, because it doesn't work like it's supposed to work anymore because the website changed.
Exactly that. So the longer that is left in there, you then have to account for changes on the core website and then updating that experiment so it's not broken anymore.
And that never happens.
It's never going to be maintained, right? So just a key point there. Another reason not to leave them in that A/B test.
Well, Abi, thanks so much for sharing all these tips with us. So doing QA for the sum, besides all those practical points, do you have some more overall insights that you think you have picked up on that others in CRO or UX should start looking into?
So I guess a little bit about what we were just saying. Sometimes the simplest approach to optimization is the best. So starting with that site audit, right? Stop trying to run before you can walk. Get your house in order before you try and do anything else. Sometimes the best things you can do are staring you right in the face. If only you had somebody to point them out to you. Okay, people working on the same website day in and day out, they kind of get blinkers on. They find shortcuts to do stuff, and it's not really reflective of what the users are doing. And sometimes getting somebody in to come in afresh and go, ooh, I can see some problems here. But that's one of the simplest ways to start optimizing whatever your digital product is. Get a fresh set of eyes of it, because we're all guilty of getting too familiar with stuff, right? We don't see it. We figure out ways around it, or we don't want to see it because it's a problem we don't want to deal with. So sometimes it just takes somebody to go, oh, by the way, did you know? So that's kind of one of the things. And another thing that I'd like to see is kind of people paying a bit more attention to how we can incorporate principles of accessibility into our A/B testing. That would be lovely. So that has a couple of impacts. One is kind of just making sure that our A/B tests are accessible to everybody, right? Everybody knows that websites need to be accessible for users these days, otherwise you get into hot water if they decide to sue you. And a lot of people are now doing that option. So let's make sure our websites are accessible to start off with. And then let's make sure that when we're A/B testing, we're not compromising that accessibility of these websites. Another impact people don't think about. And it's evident because, I've looked at some A/B tests and I can't even read what it's saying because the design, the font's so tiny or the contrast is so low. Maybe it's just because I'm 43 and I'm getting old now. I don't know what the answer is. But have a look at the accessibility guidelines, right? There are some really good examples of 10 top tips of accessible guidelines that you must follow that will make an awesome impact. And I've run tests that have been as simple as making font size bigger, right? Making contrast better. And they've won, right? And they won in particular, with older audiences. Right? So people my age, and it's proven that simple stuff like that not only helps everybody in general, because you're making the site more accessible for everybody, but it has a massive impact on certain audiences that are affected. And, people think, oh, accessibility, that's like people with disabilities. It's really not. It benefits everybody. So whether you're Joe down the street at 22 or Abi sat here in Oxford at 43 with glasses on, it makes no difference. The impact is really substantial. So I'd love to see people doing more work around improving that on websites. It'd be awesome.
Yeah. Abi, my final question for you. Any books you're reading right now or you would want to recommend to our audience?
Goodness, if I had the time to read books now, I'd be living the life of luxury, honestly. The best I get to read at the minute is, homeschooling stuff. But I'm going to recommend one book because, caveats aside, I did help edit this. But it's a book by Daphne Tideman and Ward Van Gasteren. I think I said that right. You're going to have to pronounce that properly for me.
Yeah. It's Daphne Tiedemann and Ward van Gasteren. They're Dutch. So, they're not the easiest names.
She'll forgive me. I'm sure that I've, totally rubbished how to pronounce those names. Yeah. But it's called Growing Happy Clients. And I believe it's available on Amazon. But it's a really nice book because I think even, as an expert, whatever that definition is, sometimes we kind of forget to go back to the basics and kind of critique our own performance and our own development because we're just kind of trying to get through every single day. But helping Daphne with this book kind of gave me some good kick up the pants moments, if you want, to try and, look at things in a different way, because after 16 years, it's inevitable that you can look at stuff in one way after a while. There's only so much growth you can do. But Daphne's book was a really good read and quite funny in places as well. So a bit of light bedtime reading, perhaps. Growing Happy Clients.
Nice. Thank you so much, Abi. Thanks for sharing all of this with us. Hope to talk to you soon, and good luck with homeschooling.
Oh, thanks so much. Bye-bye.
And this concludes Season 3, Episode 8 of the Zero Cafe podcast with Abi Hough. Make sure to check out the show notes on the Zero Cafe website for links to some additional information on today's topic. In the next episode, I'll be talking to Alexander Fabian, data scientist at EXP, or better known as the Microsoft's experimentation platform team. And we're going to talk about his personal take on kickstarting and keeping the A/B testing momentum going in your company. Talk to you then. Always be optimizing.